The wind howled as Miranda pulled her car into the gravel parking lot of the Blue Haven Motel, its neon sign sputtering with an electric hum. She had been driving for hours, her eyes gritty with exhaustion, and this remote, off-highway stop seemed like her last chance to rest before her vision blurred entirely. The clerk at the desk, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a too-wide smile, slid her the key to room 6 with a deliberate slowness that made her shiver. The room smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The carpet was threadbare in spots, and the curtains hung limp and uneven. Still, the bed looked serviceable, and Miranda convinced herself she was too tired to care about the faint stains on the sheets. She double-checked the lock on the door, pushed the rickety dresser in front of it for good measure, and lay down fully clothed. It wasn't the bed that kept her awake at first. It was the noise. Faint footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, stopping and starting in an irregular rhythm. Every now and then, she swore she heard a low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled. When she finally mustered the courage to peek through the peephole, the hall was empty. She told herself it was just another guest and returned to the bed, her skin crawling with unease. At 3:14 a.m., she woke to the sound of knocking. It wasn't loud, more of a rhythmic tapping, deliberate and persistent, coming from the wall behind her. Her first thought was of pipes, but the pattern was too intentional. Tap, tap, tap. Silence. Tap, tap, tap. Gathering her nerve, she pressed her ear to the wall and listened. There was a faint rustling, followed by a low whisper she couldn't quite make out. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible. The knocking stopped. Miranda sat frozen, the silence thick and oppressive. Just as she began to relax, there was a loud thud, this time from the door. Her heart thundered as she scrambled out of bed, grabbing her phone as she crept toward the dresser barricade. She listened, but whoever or whatever had knocked wasn't making a sound anymore. She peeked through the peephole again, half expecting to see nothing, but there was something there, a shadow too tall and too still to be human. She stumbled back, her mind racing. When her phone's screen lit up, her relief was short-lived. There was no signal. The motel's landline, she remembered. That was her only hope. She moved the dresser aside as quietly as she could, opened the door a crack, and darted into the hallway. It was empty, the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead casting flickering shadows. The desk was only a few doors away, but the corridor felt endless. When she reached the lobby, she found the clerk slumped over the desk, his face pale and slick with sweat. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Miranda called out to him, but he didn't respond. The old rotary phone on the counter taunted her, its receiver dangling from its cord. She reached for it and froze. A low, guttural growl came from behind her. Miranda turned slowly. At the far end of the lobby, just visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. It moved toward her, its steps uneven and jerky, as though unused to walking. She screamed, but the sound seemed swallowed by the room. Grabbing the phone, she dialed frantically, her fingers slipping on the dial. The figure was closer now, its movements faster, more deliberate. As it reached the edge of the counter, she slammed the receiver into its face. The figure recoiled with a hiss, its head snapping back unnaturally, but it didn't stop. Miranda ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The corridors twisted and turned, the numbers on the doors blurring together. She thought she could hear the creature behind her, but when she looked back, the halls were empty. Finally, she stumbled into her room and slammed the door, her chest heaving. She shoved the dresser back in front of the door and backed away, clutching a lamp like a weapon. The room was silent, save for her ragged breathing. Minutes passed, then hours. The sun began to rise, its light creeping through the cracks in the curtains. When Miranda finally dared to open the door, the hallway was pristine, devoid of any sign of the previous night's terror. She ran to the lobby, but the desk was unmanned, the chair empty. The clerk's name tag lay on the counter, covered in a thick layer of dust. She fled to her car, the gravel crunching beneath her tires as she sped away. Days later, Miranda read an article online about the Blue Haven Motel. It had been abandoned for over a decade, condemned after a series of unexplained deaths. Among the photos of its decaying interior was one that made her blood run cold. a blurry image of a shadowy figure with faintly glowing eyes standing just outside room 6.
Story number 2.
Kayla had always been drawn to the solitude of road trips. This one, she decided, would be no different. A solo drive through the desolate backroads of Nevada seemed like the perfect escape from the noise of her life. That was until her car's engine sputtered and died in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any town. It was already dark when she spotted the faint glow of the Desert Rose Motel's sign flickering in the distance. Relieved but uneasy, Kayla trudged up the gravel road, her suitcase dragging behind her. The motel was a squat, single-story building, the paint peeling, and the parking lot barren except for an old pickup truck parked near the far end. The neon sign buzzed ominously, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked asphalt. Inside the lobby, the air was stale, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. Behind the counter sat a woman, her thin lips twisted into a forced smile. "Room?" Kayla asked, her voice hoarse from the dry, desert air. The woman nodded but said nothing, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 3. Kayla hesitated. "Is there somewhere I can call a tow truck?" "No phones," the woman replied curtly. "No cell service either." Something about her voice, low and toneless, sent a shiver down Kayla's spine. She took the key without another word and made her way to the room. The room was worse than she had expected. Dark, with a musty smell that clung to her nose and throat. The wallpaper here was also peeling, and the carpet was stained with something she didn't want to imagine. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its dim light flickering every few seconds. She locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob for good measure, and collapsed onto the bed. The springs groaned under her weight. That was when she noticed it, the mirror. It hung on the wall opposite the bed, slightly tilted, as though someone had knocked it loose but never bothered to fix it. Her reflection stared back at her, warped and shadowy in the dim light. Something about it felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Exhaustion won out over unease, and Kayla closed her eyes. She woke hours later to a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the mirror. Her breath hitched as she sat up, staring at her reflection. It stared back, unmoving, except for its hand, which was tapping softly against the glass. Kayla froze. Her reflection's lips curled into a slow, sinister smile. She hadn't smiled. She was certain of it. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something on the other side of the mirror was trying to get out. She scrambled off the bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the lamp from the bedside table. With trembling hands, she swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards flying across the room. But what lay behind the mirror wasn't a wall. It was a dark, yawning space that seemed to stretch infinitely, like a void. From the darkness, a hand emerged. It was skeletal. The skin stretched taut over its bones, and its fingers ended in jagged claws. Kayla screamed as the hand gripped the edge of the broken frame, pulling the rest of its body into the room. The thing that crawled out was like nothing she had ever seen. Its face was a grotesque mimicry of her own, but its eyes were hollow sockets, and its mouth was filled with rows of needle-like teeth. It moved toward her with jerky, unnatural motions, the sound of its joints cracking echoing in the tiny room. Kayla bolted for the door, but the creature was faster. It grabbed her ankle, its grip like ice, and dragged her toward the mirror. She clawed at the carpet, screaming, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before being pulled into the void was her own reflection, standing on the other side of the shattered glass, watching with an expression of cold indifference. The next morning, the Desert Rose Motel was as quiet as ever. The woman at the desk looked up as a new traveler entered, a weary man with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Room?" he asked. The woman nodded and handed him a key. "Room 3. The Desert Rose Motel always has vacancies, but no one ever seems to check out."
Story number 3.
The rain came down in torrents as Ethan pulled into the lot of the Hollow Pines Motel. The storm had grown worse over the last hour, and the narrow mountain road was nearly impassable. The motel stood alone at the edge of the woods, its faded sign barely visible through the downpour. Reluctantly, Ethan decided to spend the night there and continue his journey in the morning. The lobby was deserted when he entered, save for a dusty desk with an old brass bell. He rang it twice before a figure emerged from the back room. The man was gaunt, his face pale and waxy like a mannequin left too long in the sun. His smile was unnerving, wide and unblinking. "Room for the night?" the clerk asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, suddenly uneasy. "Yeah, just one night." The man handed him a key marked with the number 7. "Enjoy your stay," he said, but the way he lingered on the word stay sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Room 7 was at the far end of the row, its door slightly warped from age. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with wallpaper peeling in strips and a damp smell that made Ethan wrinkle his nose. A single chair sat in the corner, facing the bed. It was an old rocker, its surface polished smooth by years of use. Ethan felt inexplicably drawn to it, but something about its placement bothered him. It was as though someone, or something, had been sitting there, watching the bed. Brushing off his unease, Ethan locked the door, set his suitcase down, and lay on the bed. His exhaustion outweighed his discomfort, and before long he drifted into a restless sleep. He woke with a start sometime after midnight. The storm outside had grown quieter, but a new sound filled the room, the faint creak of wood, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the corner. Ethan turned his head slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The rocking chair was moving, back and forth, as though someone invisible sat there pushing gently against the floor. "Hello?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, barely audible over the creaking. The chair stopped. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of Ethan's pounding heart. Then from the darkness came a whisper. "Get out." Ethan froze, his skin crawling. The voice was low, guttural, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Summoning his courage, he reached for the lamp on the bedside table and switched it on. The chair was empty. Trying to steady his breathing, Ethan stood and approached the chair. There was nothing unusual about it, but the floor beneath it was worn in a circular pattern, as though it had been rocked for years, far more than just wear and tear could explain. As he turned to return to bed, he noticed something he hadn't before. The mirror on the opposite wall reflected the room perfectly, except for one horrifying detail. In the reflection, the rocking chair was still moving. Ethan backed away, his legs trembling. The chair in the room remained still, but in the mirror it rocked faster, more violently, as though whoever or whatever was in it had grown agitated. Then the reflection changed. The chair stopped rocking, and a figure appeared in it, a shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes that stared straight at Ethan. The figure stood, its movements jerky and unnatural, and began walking toward him. Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed his keys and bolted from the room, not bothering to pack his things. As he ran to his car, he glanced back at the motel. Every room's window was dark, except for one, room 7. In its window, he saw the shadowy figure standing, its hollow eyes watching him. The next morning, Ethan reached the nearest town and reported what had happened to the local police. When they investigated, they found the Hollow Pines Motel abandoned, its rooms filled with decades of dust and decay. Room 7, however, was different. The chair in the corner looked freshly used, its surface worn smooth, and carved into the wood of the chair in jagged letters was a single word: stay. If you're ever on the road and come across the Hollow Pines Motel, drive past it. No matter how tired you are, some places aren't worth the rest.
Story number 4.
Lila was exhausted by the time she saw the illuminated sign for the Meadow Creek Inn. It had been a long day of driving through endless stretches of countryside, and the idea of sleeping in her car again made her ache. The motel stood isolated, surrounded by fields and dense woods that seemed to stretch into infinity. The warm yellow glow of its vacancy sign felt almost inviting. The lobby was empty except for a middle-aged woman with tightly curled hair and an old-fashioned cardigan. Her eyes were unnervingly bright, and her smile seemed too perfect, like a mask. "Room for one?" Lila asked, setting her backpack down on the counter. The woman nodded. "Room 12, the end of the hall." Her voice was overly chipper, but her hands trembled slightly as she handed Lila the key. As Lila turned to leave, the woman called after her, "And if you hear knocking, don't answer." The words froze Lila in her tracks. She turned to question the woman, but the clerk was already retreating into the back office, the door clicking shut behind her. Puzzled and uneasy, Lila made her way to her room. The hallway was dimly lit, with outdated sconces that buzzed faintly. The carpet smelled faintly of damp earth, and she thought she could hear something scurrying in the walls. Room 12 was at the very end, its door marked with a brass plate dulled by years of tarnish. The room itself was unremarkable. Basic furniture, a small TV mounted on the wall, and a bed with a faded floral comforter. Lila locked the door, drew the curtains, and set her bag on the chair by the desk. Her nerves began to settle as she changed into her pajamas and lay down. The bed was lumpy, but it would do. She fell asleep quickly. At first, the sound was faint, barely enough to stir her. A soft knock, knock, knock. Lila rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Then it came again. Louder. Knock, knock, knock. Her eyes flew open. She turned toward the door, heart pounding. The knocks were slow, deliberate, as though someone was testing her resolve. Hello? She called out, her voice shaky. The knocking stopped. Lila sat up in bed, straining to listen. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the TV she'd left on. She told herself it was probably just another guest, maybe someone drunk or confused about their room. But something about the stillness that followed felt wrong. She lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Minutes passed. Then, just as she was beginning to relax, knock, knock, knock. This time it was closer. It wasn't coming from the door. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was coming from the wall next to the bed, the one that bordered the neighboring room. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, a scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. "Who's there?" she whispered, even though she didn't expect an answer. The scratching stopped. Then the knocks resumed, louder, and with them came a voice, low and hoarse, barely audible. "Let me in." Lila scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. There was no signal. She backed into the corner of the room, her eyes darting between the wall and the door. The knocking grew faster, more insistent, as the voice repeated, "Let me in! Let me in!" Suddenly, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Lila waited, her heart racing. Then from the ceiling came a slow, deliberate knock. She looked up, and her stomach turned. A dark stain was spreading across the plaster, directly above her bed. It seeped outward, dripping thick black droplets onto the mattress. The knocking resumed, louder than ever, this time from every wall. The voice, no longer a whisper, echoed through the room. "Let me in!" Lila bolted for the door, yanking it open and fleeing into the hallway. It was empty, the dim sconces flickering erratically. She sprinted toward the lobby, but as she rounded the corner, she stopped dead. The hallway had changed. It stretched endlessly before her, the doors on either side multiplying, their brass numbers distorted and illegible. The air grew colder with each step she took, and the floor beneath her feet felt soft, like damp soil. Behind her, the knocking began again. She didn't dare look back. Lila ran until she reached a door at the very end of the hall. It wasn't marked with a number, but she shoved it open anyway, desperate to escape. She stumbled outside into the night. The motel was gone. Instead, she stood in the middle of a dark forest, the trees looming over her like sentinels. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of knocking. The next morning, the Meadow Creek Inn's clerk sat at her desk, her unnerving smile still in place. A new guest walked in, rain dripping from his jacket. "Room for one?" he asked. The woman nodded, her bright eyes glinting. "Room 12, she said, sliding him the key. "And if you hear knocking, don't answer."
Story number 5.
Marcus didn't want to stop, but the fuel gauge on his car had dipped dangerously close to empty, and he hadn't seen another gas station for miles. The Crooked Oak Motel loomed on the side of the highway, its flickering sign barely visible through the fog that clung to the night like a second skin. The building was small, weather-beaten, and looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 1970s. Still, it was better than being stranded. Marcus parked his car, grabbed his duffel bag, and headed inside. The lobby was unsettlingly quiet, save for the faint buzz of a fluorescent light. A man emerged from a back room, a stout, balding figure with yellowed teeth and a lazy eye that seemed to track somewhere over Marcus's shoulder. "Room for the night?" the man asked, his voice gravely. Marcus nodded, suppressing a shiver. "Yeah, just one night." The clerk slid him a key labeled Room 4. "Pay in the morning," the man said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. As Marcus turned to leave, the clerk muttered, "Don't go out after midnight." Marcus paused, his hand on the lobby door. "What did you say?" But the clerk was already gone, the sound of a heavy door slamming somewhere behind the counter. Shaking off his unease, Marcus made his way to Room 4. The fog had thickened, swallowing the dim glow of the motel's lights, and he felt an almost primal urge to hurry inside. The room was what he expected: outdated decor, the faint smell of mildew, and a small TV sitting atop a chipped dresser. The window overlooked the parking lot, the fog reducing the view to a haze of gray. He double-checked the lock on the door and collapsed onto the bed, Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window, but exhaustion dragged him into a restless sleep. Marcus woke suddenly, his heart pounding. He didn't know what had startled him at first, but then he heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, shuffling, and they stopped directly outside his door. He stared at the sliver of light beneath the door, frozen. A shadow passed by, slow and deliberate, and then the footsteps moved on. Relieved, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He told himself it was just another guest, maybe the clerk doing rounds, and lay back down. Then came the scratching. It started softly at first, like nails dragging lightly against the door. Then it grew louder, more frantic, as though something was desperately trying to get inside. Marcus sat up, his body rigid with fear. "Who's there?" he called. The scratching stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice. "Let me in." The voice was thin, raspy, and wrong, like it belonged to someone whose throat had been slashed. Marcus backed away, grabbing his phone from the bedside table. "No signal. Go away!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The voice came again, this time from the window. "Let me in." Marcus turned toward the window, his stomach dropping. A figure stood just outside, its face pressed against the glass. The fog distorted its features, but its eyes glowed faintly, yellow and unblinking. Its hand, gnarled and clawed, dragged slowly down the window, leaving streaks of condensation. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his bag. "This isn't happening," he whispered to himself. The knocking began again, this time from the bathroom door. Marcus's blood ran cold. The bathroom was inside the room. The door rattled as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. "I know you're there," the voice croaked. With no other options, Marcus grabbed his car keys and bolted for the door. He didn't care what was waiting outside, he just had to get away from whatever was inside. The hallway was empty, but the fog seemed thicker, almost alive, curling around his ankles as he ran. He didn't stop until he reached his car, fumbling with the keys as his breath came in panicked gasps. When the engine roared to life, he glanced back at the motel. Every window was dark, except for one, room 4. A figure stood in the window, its glowing eyes locked onto him as he sped away. The next morning, a state trooper stopped by the Crooked Oak Motel, responding to a call from a passing driver who'd seen an abandoned car by the roadside. The trooper knocked on the motel office door, but there was no answer. Inside room 4, the bed was perfectly made, the air thick with an unnatural chill. On the bathroom mirror, written in condensation, were 2 words, "Let me in." If you ever pass the Crooked Oak Motel, keep driving. No matter how empty your tank or how heavy your eyelids, some places aren't meant for the living.
Story number 6.
The rain was relentless as Jenna pulled off the highway, her GPS insisting there was nowhere else nearby. The Willow's End Motel looked like it belonged in a ghost town. The paint peeled from its siding, and the single flickering light above the lobby door cast an eerie yellow glow. She sighed, pulling her coat tighter. It was just one night. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew, and a dusty fan turned lazily above her head. The clerk, an older man with sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes, gave her a thin-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his face. "Room 8, he said, sliding a tarnished brass key across the counter. "Sleep well." The way he said it made her pause, but before she could ask, he turned and shuffled into a back room, leaving her alone in the dim light. Jenna made her way to room 8, her shoes splashing through puddles on the cracked pavement. The air was damp, and the surrounding trees leaned in too closely, their skeletal branches scratching against the sides of the building. The room was marginally better than she'd expected. The furniture was outdated but clean enough, and the bed didn't look like it had been slept in too many times. There was a large wardrobe in the corner, its dark wood giving the room an oppressive feel. She shrugged off her coat and sat on the bed, too tired to care about the eerie atmosphere. After a quick shower, she locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and climbed under the thin blanket. The rain beat against the window, a steady rhythm that lulled her into a shallow sleep. At first, she thought she was dreaming when she heard the creak of wood. It was faint but distinct, like someone shifting their weight on old floorboards. Her eyes fluttered open, and she glanced at the wardrobe. It was open. Just an inch, but enough to send a wave of unease coursing through her. She was sure she hadn't opened it, hadn't even touched it. Sitting up, she stared at the wardrobe, her heart pounding. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. Summoning her courage, she slipped out of bed and approached the wardrobe. Her hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the door and yanked it open. Empty. Jenna let out a shaky laugh. She was being ridiculous, jumping at shadows. Closing the wardrobe firmly, she returned to bed and tried to ignore the growing unease in her chest. But the creaking began again. This time, it was louder, as though something or someone was moving inside the wardrobe. Jenna froze, her breath catching. She turned slowly and her stomach dropped. The wardrobe door was open again, wider this time. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe as she stared at the black void inside. Then, from the darkness, she saw it, a pair of eyes, pale, glowing faintly in the dim room, and locked onto her. A low, guttural whisper filled the room. "Get out!" Jenna bolted, grabbing her keys and throwing open the door. Rain soaked her instantly, but she didn't stop until she was in her car, the engine roaring to life. She didn't look back as she sped away, her heart hammering in her chest. The next morning, Jenna told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light and her exhaustion. She stopped at a diner a few towns over and recounted the story to a waitress, hoping to laugh it off. The waitress's face paled as she listened. "You said the Willow's End Motel?" Jenna nodded. The waitress glanced around as though someone might overhear. "That place burned down years ago. People say it's cursed. Folks who've stayed there, if they make it out, say the same thing. Something lives in the wardrobe." Jenna's blood ran cold. "But I was just there last night." The waitress shook her head. "You might have seen it, but that place hasn't been standing for decades. They say the Willow's End Motel still appears to travelers caught in storms, offering them shelter for the night. But those who stay never quite escape what waits in the wardrobe. If you see the motel, keep driving, no matter how heavy the rain falls."
Story number 7.
The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the horizon a wavering mirage. By the time Kara saw the neon sign for Red Hollow Motel, the gaslight on her dashboard had been blinking for miles. She pulled into the gravel lot, her tires crunching loudly in the oppressive silence. The motel looked ancient, its sign half-lit and buzzing faintly. It had an air of abandonment, but Kara didn't have the luxury of being picky. A single night here would get her back on the road. The lobby was dimly lit, with a bell on the counter. Kara rang it, and moments later an elderly man emerged from the shadows. He was hunched, his thin white hair plastered to his scalp, and his eyes seemed to glint unnaturally in the low light. "Room for one?" he rasped. Kara nodded, handing him cash. He slid a key across the counter, his bony fingers lingering for a moment too long. "Room 5, he said. "Don't leave the room after dark, and don't answer if anyone knocks." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly, but before she could ask, he disappeared back into the gloom. Her unease grew as she approached room 5. The air felt heavy, and the silence of the desert night pressed against her like a physical weight. The room itself was sparse, a bed with a sagging mattress, a nightstand, and a small table with a chair. The only oddity was the mirror above the dresser. It was large, taking up nearly the entire wall, and its surface was tarnished, the silver backing spotted with black. Kara avoided looking at it as she locked the door and set her bag down. The night settled in around her, the darkness outside absolute. She flipped through the static-filled channels on the TV, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. At some point, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. She woke to a sound, a faint tapping. Her eyes shot open, her heart pounding. Knock, knock. The sound was soft, hesitant, and coming from the door. Kara froze. The old man's warning echoed in her mind. "Don't answer if anyone knocks." "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:33 a.m. in glowing red numbers. Then came another sound, this one from the mirror. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind, but it grew louder, a low scraping noise. Slowly, Kara turned toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. But something was wrong. Her reflection moved. Kara hadn't. Her breath caught in her throat as the other version of herself in the mirror tilted its head, a crooked smile spreading across its face. Slowly, deliberately, the reflection raised a hand and placed it against the inside of the glass. A crack spider-webbed across the surface of the mirror. "No," Kara whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." The smile in the mirror grew wider, impossibly wide, stretching until it split her reflection's face in two. A low, guttural voice echoed from the mirror, distorted and inhuman. "Let me out." Kara bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. The knocking resumed, louder and more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. She threw the door open and ran into the night. The desert air was freezing, and the world seemed unnaturally still. Turning back, she saw the door to room 5 swinging gently in the wind. But the window glowed faintly, her reflection still staring out, its grotesque grin fixed on her. The next day, a traveler passing through the desert found Kara's car abandoned in the lot of the Red Hollow Motel. The room was empty, except for one thing. The mirror was shattered, shards scattered across the floor. In the largest shard, they swore they could see her face staring back at them. They never found her body. If you're driving through the desert and see the Red Hollow Motel, don't stop. Some doors should never be opened, and some reflections are better left unseen.
Story number 8.
Tyler hadn't planned on stopping, but the storm came out of nowhere, lightning splitting the sky as rain lashed against his windshield. His GPS was useless, and he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. When the glowing vacancy sign for the Silver Pines Motel appeared on the side of the road, it felt like a lifeline. The building was small, its once white exterior streaked with dirt and age. Tyler pulled into the lot, his tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The lobby smelled like damp carpet and stale coffee. A woman stood behind the counter, her hair pinned back in a severe bun. Her expression was distant, her eyes unfocused, as if she were looking through him. "Room for the night?" he asked, shaking the rain off his jacket. She nodded slowly, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 7. End of the hall." "Thanks," Tyler said, but she didn't respond. Her gaze lingered on him as he left, sending a chill down his spine. The hallway to room 7 was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs casting long, shifting shadows. Tyler felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the motel itself was holding its breath. Inside, the room was basic but clean enough. A single bed with a faded comforter, a TV bolted to the wall, and a nightstand with an ancient rotary phone. The window was nailed shut, the curtains tattered but drawn. He tossed his bag onto the chair and sat on the bed, flipping through the static-filled TV channels. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. At first, he thought the faint knocking sound was just the storm. But it came again, sharper this time, as if someone were rapping lightly on the wall. Tyler glanced around. The sound was coming from the adjoining door. It was an old, heavy wooden door with a rusted handle. He hadn't noticed it before, and it didn't seem to have a lock on his side. "Hello?" he called, knocking lightly on the door. There was no response, just silence. Shrugging it off, Tyler lay back on the bed and tried to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. But the knocking came again. This time, it was louder. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and insistent. He sat up, heart pounding. "Who's there?" The door shuddered slightly, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. Then a voice, low and guttural, barely audible. "Let me in." Tyler jumped to his feet, backing away. "This isn't funny," he shouted, his voice trembling. The door began to rattle violently, the sound echoing through the room. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with malice. "Let me in." Panicking, Tyler grabbed the rotary phone, but there was no dial tone. The room grew colder, his breath fogging in the air. The rattling stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. He stared at the door, his chest heaving. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. "No," he whispered, backing toward the main door. He fumbled with the lock, yanking the door open just as the adjoining door swung wide. He didn't look back as he fled into the storm, the rain drenching him instantly. When Tyler reached the lobby, the woman at the counter was gone. The lights flickered overhead, and the place felt different. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room. His heart sank as he looked out the front window. His car was gone. A noise behind him made him whirl around. The woman was there, but her face was wrong, twisted and hollow, her eyes black pits. "You should have stayed," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. Tyler ran, bursting out into the night. But the parking lot was empty, and the highway was gone. The motel was surrounded by endless woods, the storm vanishing as suddenly as it had come. He stumbled through the trees, the air growing colder with each step. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him was the sound of knocking, faint and persistent, following him wherever he went. The Silver Pines Motel is no longer listed on any map. Some say it burned down years ago, while others claim it only appears to travelers who are lost. But one thing is certain, Those who check in rarely check out.
Story number 9.
Darren had driven for hours, his eyelids heavy as the road stretched endlessly through the empty plains. When the Hollow Creek Inn appeared out of the darkness, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows, he didn't think twice about pulling over. The motel stood alone, surrounded by miles of nothingness. Its faded facade looked abandoned, but the front desk light was on. Darren parked his car and grabbed his bag, the night air unnervingly still. The lobby was barren except for a cracked counter and an ancient bell. When Darren rang it, the sharp sound echoed unnaturally. Moments later, a man shuffled out from the back. The clerk was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. His sunken eyes seemed to pierce right through Darren. "Need a room?" "Yeah, just for the night," Darren replied, uneasy but too tired to care. The man slid a tarnished key across the counter. "Room 13. End of the lot." "Thanks," Darren said, grabbing the key. As he turned to leave, the clerk spoke again, his voice low and gravelly. "Don't open the window." Darren stopped. "What?" The clerk's expression didn't change. "Whatever you hear, don't open the window." Chilled, Darren forced a nod and left. Room 13 was the last unit, its door stiff as he unlocked it. The room was stark, with a single bed, a wooden chair, and a small table. The window faced the vast plains, the glass fogged over from the cold. He locked the door and tossed his bag onto the chair, the clerk's words echoing in his mind. Trying to shake off the unease, he sat on the bed and turned on the TV. Static greeted him, the screen flickering faintly. The wind outside picked up, howling through the emptiness. But Darren couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the room felt heavy, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Just as he was starting to doze off, a sound jolted him awake. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, coming from the window. Darren's breath hitched. He stared at the fogged glass, his heart pounding. "It's just the wind," he muttered, but the tapping came again, more deliberate this time. Tap, tap, tap. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the window. The fog on the glass began to clear, revealing faint streaks as though someone or something was dragging their fingers down the outside. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was faint, almost a whisper, but it sent a shiver down Darren's spine. He stepped back, his chest tightening. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The voice returned, louder this time, distorted and unnatural. "Let me in." Darren backed away, his legs hitting the edge of the bed. He grabbed the chair and wedged it under the doorknob, his mind racing. Suddenly, the wind outside stopped. The silence was deafening. Then the window rattled violently, the glass bowing inward as though something massive was pressing against it. The fog cleared completely, and Darren saw them. Handprints, too large to be human, smeared across the outside of the glass. "Let me in!" the voice roared, shaking the walls. The lights in the room flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to grow, twisting and writhing. Darren stumbled back, his back hitting the door. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The room was silent. The window was intact. The fog returned. Darren stood there, shaking, his breaths ragged. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, the motel was eerily quiet. Darren rushed to the lobby, but it was empty. No clerk, no sign of life. The key was still in his pocket, but the door he had stayed in the night before was gone. Just a blank wall where room 13 had been. Later, Darren learned that the Hollow Creek Inn had burned down decades ago, the result of a fire that started in room 13. Legend said the guest in that room had opened the window, letting in something that should never have been allowed inside. If you ever see the Hollow Creek Inn glowing in the distance, drive on. And if you have no choice but to stay, remember one thing. No matter what you hear, never open the window.